Hey everyone, welcome back to Mountain Road Ride, and today I've got one question for you. Have you ever wondered if you can convert an older rim brake road bike into something that's a little bit more gravel worthy? Well, that's exactly what we're going to do in this video today. I'm going to show you some of the modifications that I've made to this 2014 Tractomani with rim brakes to make it just that little bit more suitable for some, I would say, light duty gravel riding. Now, if that's something of interest to you, do stick around. I'm going to walk you through all the updates that I've made to this bike, but then we're going to talk about the limitations of this setup. I'm going to take you out on the actual roads so we can see what it's capable of and what it's not capable of. All right, so with that, let's get started and look at some of the updates that I've made to this bike.
So the first thing to think about is your frame's geometry. Now I use the Tractomani's frame set, which falls into the endurance road bike category, and this actually played very nicely into my favor since it gave me a bit more of a relaxed riding position. Now this is thanks to that higher stack height and then also the shorter reach that you find on these frames. Now this frame's measurement also then compares very favorably to what you might find on the modern day all-road bike category. Now if you're using a more traditional road bike with a more slant position, it might just lead to a less forgiving ride experience on gravel, but I will mention a few tips on how to soften up a harsher ride setup later on. The next consideration for a road to gravel conversion has to be the gearing. Now gravel riding just simply requires a far easier gear than what you might find on a road bike, which means that your 52 or even your 52 front chainring might not give you the gears that you need on a gravel ride. So my objective with the gear modification was pretty straightforward and can be summarized with this one question. What was the minimum number of purchases that I needed to make for my road bike to be better suited for gravel riding? And the answer was 1. All that I needed to do was to convert my 2x setup with that 50-34-2 front chainring to a 1x setup. So I made use of the wolf tooth components chainring for Shimano cranks, and it fit perfectly onto my 105 R7000 crankset. That was it. No other changes were made in terms of the gearing, and I retained the standard 11/28 cassette in the rear. Now the reason for this is just simply to keep the cost down as low as possible, since a new cassette would have also meant getting a derailleur that could shift into that type of gear. This setup is of course far from ideal and certainly leaves me with a very limited range. That 42 front and 11 in the rear combo can easily lead to a spin out on fast moving roads or even on the downhills. Then on the other hand, that 42 plus the 28 in the rear really isn't the world's best climbing gear either, and if I'm faced with any significant climbs, then I'm surely going to run out of range quickly. Now that said, I did pick this setup with pre-selected gravel roads in mind, ones that I know will keep me within this gear range. Everyone will differ when it comes to what will work best in terms of gearing. What you can afford and where you intend to ride will dictate your selection. My recommendation in this regard is just to start with the standard stock road gearing that you've got on your bike and adjust it systematically according to the type of riding you'll be doing. So if you were paying close attention to the gearing breakdown, then you might have noticed how the rear derailleur was never changed to one that contains a clutch. Now that means that unlike with what you find with modern day gravel bike derailleurs, my old-fashioned derailleur will not help to reduce chain slap, and this in turn can lead to a drop chain. Now to prevent this, I'm relying on 2 wolf tooth products. The first is the chainring that I mentioned earlier. I've developed immense respect for the 1x wolf tooth chainrings over the last few months, and I now exclusively run wolf tooth chainrings on both my gravel as well as this converted road bike. Their drop stop tooth profile and that narrow wide design does absolute wonders to keep a chain in place, and I will easily recommend this product to anyone looking for better chain retention on a 1x setup. The second trick up my sleeve for keeping a chain in place while using a non-clutch derailleur comes in the form of the wolf tooth Gnarwolf Chainguide. I've already done a full review of this product, so be sure to check that out if you want more info, but in short, this Chainguide has never let me down and does an absolute great job to keep a chain in place. Finally, we get to the star of the show. The main challenge with this conversion project was to find a tire that would be capable of taking on gravel, yet at the same time also be skinny enough to fit inside the narrow space of a standard road frame. Enter the Panaracer GravelKing SK 700 by 26mm tire. Yep, that's one skinny gravel tire. I've reviewed the slick version of this tire in the past, but this side-by-side view should make it clear that the SK version of the tire is far better suited to provide traction on loose gravel roads. The tire certainly offers great traction thanks to the tread pattern, but its biggest highlight has to be the 60 to 100 psi pressure rating. Now, although the 60 psi sounds high when you compare it to regular gravel tires where the pressure range sort of between 25 to 45 psi, the 26mm SKs actually still feel fairly forgiving. Now, the slimmer tire casing is firm, but it still offers a surprising amount of shock absorption over rougher surfaces. I have to say that these tires and that lower tire pressure rating are by far the most important upgrades that you can make to get your road bike gravel worthy. Now, what about punches? Unfortunately, the 26mm and 28mm version of this tire is not compatible with a tubeless setup, and this means that a plan B has to be followed, and that comes in the form of an old-fashioned slime inner tube. Now, the green valve cap is an indication that the inner tubes are filled with a sealant, green slime in this instance, that when punctured should fill up the hole and plug it. In theory, it's similar to a tubeless setup, but instead the inner tube holds the sealant. It's not foolproof, but any measures to help reduce flats are definitely worth taking. The last major question has to be about the tire clearance. The 26mm tires easily fit into my frame, and you'll be able to tell that I could even have bumped it up to a 28mm model. I played it safe this time around, but in the future I'd definitely opt to go for the 28mm size instead, and I'm pretty sure that most rim brake road bikes should have no issue to clear that size either. Let's wrap up the technicalities of this build and address ways to soften up the ride feel of an overly aggressive traditional road frame. A major perk with the Domani is the inclusion of the ISO-speed decoupler that you find on the C-tube. This design provides some additional compliance in the C-tube, which decouples from the top tube, providing it with some extra flex. Now, obviously not all frames have a similar design, but that's where a suspension stem and seat post can come in super handy. I don't have any on my bike, but be sure to check out the products from Redshift, Connect and also Crane Creek to see what they have to offer in terms of suspension that can be added to a road bike to make it better suited for gravel. Now we get to the fun part. Let's talk about how the setup fared out in the real world. The short answer to that, surprisingly well. When the surface of the road ranges between sort of a smooth to medium gravel, then the setup can still easily handle it. The ride is certainly not as stable as what you find with a wider gravel tire, but after a while it actually becomes very entertaining to ride. So much so that I was even able to start leaning down lower to get creative with my camera angles. Now, I must say that it feels a little strange to look down only to see such a skinny tire in front of you while on gravel. However, this tire still performed tremendously well, and it really surprised me with just the amount of shock absorption that I got from running them at 60 psi. To a complete gravel newbie, this tire might feel a bit unsteady at first, but over time you really do get more comfortable with the feeling of letting the bike float underneath of you. Now let's take a closer look at two riding scenarios. The one is a short yet steep uphill where I was climbing out of the saddle. So as you can see, when powering over this hill and rocking heavily from side to side, I still maintained full control of the bike. This hill did however not test the extreme end of my gear range, and that's something I would have to still put to the test on a much more significant uphill at a later date. Once over the top of a hill, you very often find a fast downhill, and that's exactly what we've got in this next shot. Now, this might be the area where the rim brakes are a bit of a limiting factor, and it does require braking into corners and that downhill a little earlier compared to the disc brakes. Now, you can see from this shot how I pick my lines more carefully. I lean into corners more gently, and I try to avoid the washboard as much as possible. I even had to dodge an unexpected car, but overall, the setup was able to get me through the section. Not bad at all. Overall, I'm very pleased with this setup, and it performed much better than what I expected at the outset.
Alright, so you've seen the bike in action out on the gravel roads. Let's now wrap up this conversation and talk a little bit about some of my key takeaways from riding with this bike on the gravel roads. Now, we'll have to be realistic about this. This is not a setup that you're going to take to a race or an event where conditions are completely unknown. Those roads that I took on for my ride, I know very well. I can fully anticipate every single corner that's coming up, every downhill that's coming up, and I pretty much know the conditions of the road surface just as well. So that eliminates a lot of the unknown and uncertainties when riding with this type of setup. So I knew that I had to brake a little bit earlier into some of the corners, some of the washboard sections I could maybe avoid by not taking an inside line on some corners, and in general, I just also needed to be a little bit more cautious when riding around on those gravel roads. Pick better lines, pick better braking points, and not assume that the bike is just going to withstand anything that I throw at it. So that is sort of the disclaimer with this type of setup. That being said, I think it is a very capable setup, and to be honest, you know, if you are going to take on just regular, well-maintained state gravel roads, I think this bike can take it on, you know. So that for me is what makes this setup such a capable setup, and also something that is very worthwhile pursuing if you're not quite sold on the idea of getting a separate standalone gravel bike just yet. Maybe you've got that spare road bike that's been sitting in the back of the garage for quite a number of years. Then hey, who knows, this type of setup could just be what you need to convert that bike fairly affordably into something that is gravel worthy, at least some light duty gravel worthy roads, and you can go and explore some of the areas that you might not necessarily see from the regular paved road. So yeah, I am very pleased with this setup. It's something that I will use in the future. Definitely not for my regular gravel adventures. For those rides, I will still use my dedicated gravel bike. But on days when I'm just in the mood for, you know, my regular road bike, I'm not going to have to go and ride over any crazy chunky gravel roads, then who knows, this could be a very handy backup, just in case my other gravel bike needs to go into a shop or something like that. Alright, so with that, thanks for watching, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you like this type of content. We'll be back in the future with more gravel content here on Mountain Road Ride. Until next time, enjoy your ride.